data from Europe suggests rural regions are quietly outperforming their urban counterparts on innovation metrics. And we ask whether that's a genuine shift, or whether we finally just started measuring things the right way. Plus, $1 billion for Filipino farmers, 200,000 AI annotators working night shifts in Indian villages, and what absorptive capacity theory might actually tell us about how rural communities learn. Stay with us. I'm Art.
I'm Jan.
And this is the Rural Innovator, a weekly look at the research, news, and projects shaping rural innovation, drawn from the library at ruralinnovations.org.
Let's get into the research this week, and I want to start with a paper that might seem like an odd fit for a rural innovation show, but I think it earns its place. It's a study on financial technology adoption in banks across Gulf Cooperation Council countries. GCC, for listeners, that's Saudi Arabia, UAE, Kuwait, Qatar, Bahrain, and Oman.
Before we get into the data, why does a GCC banking study land in a rural innovation library?
Fair question. The connection is fintech access in underserved markets. And a lot of the GCC's population outside the major city centers, think rural Saudi Arabia, the smaller Omani towns, faces similar access to finance challenges that rural communities elsewhere do. The mechanisms being studied here have transferable implications.
All right, walk me through the methodology.
So the researchers built a 73-item fintech diffusion index, 73 individual indicators, covering things like mobile banking penetration, digital payment infrastructure, algorithmic lending tools, and open banking adoption. They applied that index across a set of GCC-listed banks and then looked at the relationship between index scores and two outcomes, profitability and market value.
And what did they find?
The headline finding is that higher fintech implementation correlates with better market performance. Banks that scored higher on the diffusion index tended to command higher market valuations. UAE banks led adoption overall.
Which doesn't surprise me. Dubai's been building that infrastructure for a long time. But here's what I'd push back on a little. Correlation between fintech adoption and market value in a listed bank doesn't automatically mean fintech is doing the work. Could be that well-resourced banks adopt fintech because they already have the capital and capacity to do so.
That's the reverse causality problem, and it's a real limitation of this kind of study. The paper doesn't fully resolve it. The design is correlational, not experimental. So yes, we should be careful about reading this as adopt fintech, get better returns. It might be already strong banks also happen to adopt fintech.
So what's actually useful here for practitioners, for someone thinking about rural financial access, say a credit union in a small Saskatchewan, Saska Chehwan community considering a digital lending platform?
I think the index itself is the most practically useful contribution. 73 items is a lot, but having a structured way to assess where an institution sits on the fintech adoption curve, that's actionable. It gives smaller institutions a diagnostic tool rather than just a vague exhortation to go digital.
That I can see the value in. A rural credit union's not competing with a GCC investment bank, but the question of where are we on this curve and what's the next logical step is the same question.
Exactly. And the profitability piece, while it needs to be taken with some caution, does suggest that incremental fintech adoption doesn't appear to hurt performance, which matters for boards that are nervous about the investment.
Right. Because in a lot of small institutions, the risk calculus is, we could spend on this technology or we could not, and what's the downside either way? This study at least suggests the downside of not adopting may be larger than the downside of adopting.
That's probably the most honest takeaway. Okay, second paper. This one's a classic. It's older, published in the early 2000s, but it was added to the library this week because it's foundational for a lot of what we discuss here. It's on absorptive capacity, learning, and performance in international joint ventures.
Absorptive capacity, that term gets thrown around a lot. What does it actually mean in this paper's framing?
So absorptive capacity, in the original Cohen and Leventhal sense, is basically an organization's ability to recognize the value of new external knowledge, assimilate it, and apply it. What this paper does is break that single concept into 3 distinct components and examine each one separately.
What are the 3?
Understanding new knowledge, which the researchers found is influenced by trust and by relative capacity, meaning how capable you are relative to your partner. Assimilating knowledge, which is shaped by learning structures. So whether you have formal processes for capturing and sharing what you're learning, and applying knowledge, which is driven by strategy and by how your organization actually uses what it's absorbed.
And the context is joint venture specifically. Why does that matter for rural innovation?
Because a lot of rural innovation happens through partnerships between municipalities and universities, between cooperatives and private firms, between indigenous communities and government agencies. The joint venture framework maps onto those relationships pretty cleanly.
I've seen this play out directly. A rural municipality partners with a university extension program, say an agricultural technology pilot. The municipality has the land and the local relationships. The university has the knowledge. And the whole thing succeeds or fails based on exactly this question. Can the local organization actually absorb and apply what the university knows?
And the paper's finding on trust is particularly relevant there. The ability to even understand incoming knowledge is influenced by trust in the partner. If the community doesn't trust the university extension team, if there's a history of extractive research, of outsiders coming in and taking data without benefit flowing back, that first component of absorptive capacity is already impaired.
Which is something that comes up constantly in Indigenous community contexts in Canada. The trust infrastructure has to be built before the knowledge transfer can happen. This paper gives that a theoretical grounding.
The limitation, though, is that this was studied in international joint ventures, large firms, often in manufacturing, operating across national boundaries. The sample doesn't include the kind of community-scale partnerships we're describing, so we're extrapolating when we apply it there.
Still worth naming. The extrapolation feels directionally sound even if it's not validated in a rural community sample.
Agreed. And the learning structures finding is actionable regardless of context. If you want your organization to assimilate knowledge, you need formal processes for capturing it, not just informal goodwill. That applies whether you're a multinational or a grain cooperative in rural Manitoba.
How many rural organizations have that? A formal knowledge capture process? I'd guess it's the minority.
Probably. And that's a structural gap, not a capacity gap. It's not that people don't know things. It's that there's no system for making that knowledge organizational rather than individual. When the person who carried it leaves, it goes with them.
That's the classic succession problem in rural organizations. Someone retires and takes 30 years of knowledge out the door because it was never written down, never formalized.
Which connects to the third paper this week, on regional innovation systems. This is also a foundational piece, and it does something I find genuinely useful. It tries to define what a regional innovation system actually is and how you'd identify one in practice.
Because the term regional innovation system gets used very loosely. I've heard it applied to a city of 800,000 and to a county of 3,000.
Right. The paper tries to tighten that up. It argues that a genuine regional innovation system has to have interactive learning between firms, research institutions, and supporting organizations. Not just the presence of those actors, but actual flows of knowledge between them. Co-location isn't sufficient.
That's an important distinction. You can have a university and a bunch of farms in the same region and have essentially zero knowledge flow between them.
Exactly. And the paper makes a pointed argument about Europe specifically. It says Europe lags behind the United States in innovation, partly because European governments over-rely on public intervention, treating every market underperformance as a market failure that requires a public program.
That's a provocative claim. I'm not sure I'd buy it wholesale.
Neither would I fully. The paper's prescription, more market mechanisms, less public subsidy, is debatable. And the evidence for it in this particular paper is more theoretical than empirical. But the diagnostic point, that the presence of public programs doesn't automatically generate interactive learning, that holds up.
In rural Canada, I'd actually flip the argument. The problem isn't too much public intervention, it's that public programs often aren't designed in ways that stimulate the knowledge flows the paper's describing. There's money flowing, but it's not creating the interactions.
That's a fair reframe. The paper's critique might be more accurately directed at poorly designed intervention than at intervention per se.
What does it say about clusters? Because clusters and regional innovation systems get conflated too.
The paper draws a distinction. Clusters are geographic concentrations of related firms and industries. Think Silicon Valley or the auto sector in southern Ontario. Regional innovation systems are broader and include the institutional infrastructure, universities, policy bodies, financial systems. You can have a cluster without a regional innovation system, and vice versa.
The cluster without system scenario, that feels very familiar in agriculture. You've got dense concentrations of canola producers in Saskatchewan, but the knowledge economy infrastructure, the labs, the venture capital, the technology transfer offices, is thin on the ground.
And that's precisely the gap the paper would say needs closing. The cluster is there. The system isn't fully formed around it. The knowledge economy piece is what's missing.
All right. Let's move to the news and development segment. And I want to start with the European Joint Research Centre report on urban-rural innovation gaps, because it connects directly to that last paper in ways I think are worth unpacking.
The headline from that report is striking. New granular metrics, and I want to emphasize the word granular because it matters, reveal that over 20% of rural regions in the EU are outperforming the EU average on R&D investment, patents, trademarks, and industrial designs.
20%. That's not a small outlier group. That's 1 in 5 rural European regions beating the urban average on those measures.
And the granular metrics piece is doing a lot of work in that finding. Previous assessments of rural innovation used regional-level data that averaged out across large geographic areas. What the JRC did here was get more fine-grained, looking at smaller units. And suddenly rural excellence becomes visible that was previously hidden by aggregation.
Which raises the question I teased in the open. Is this a genuine shift in rural innovation performance, or has it been there all along and we just couldn't see it?
I think it's genuinely both. There's a measurement artifact here. The granular data reveals things that blunt instruments missed. But there's also real performance improvement in rural regions that have built around specialized industries and public research facilities.
What kinds of industries?
The report points to things like precision agriculture, renewable energy, advanced manufacturing in smaller industrial towns, and tourism-adjacent creative industries. Rural excellence clusters, the report's term, tend to have a specific anchor sector, not a diversified economy.
Which is consistent with the cluster literature. You don't build innovation capacity across the board in a small region. You go deep on what you've got.
And the public research facility angle is interesting. Some of the highest performing rural regions have a national lab or an agricultural research station as a key anchor. That's the regional innovation system argument from the third paper, playing out in practice.
For Canadian listeners, think of places like Lethbridge, with the Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada Research Centre, or Swift Current with the Crop Research Station. Those facilities create knowledge flows that wouldn't otherwise exist in a small rural city.
The caution I'd add is that 20% outperforming doesn't mean 80% struggling are being helped by this analysis. This report is useful for identifying what works in high-performing rural regions, but it shouldn't be read as rural innovation is fine. Stop worrying.
Fair. The 80% matters as much as the 20%, maybe more.
Let's turn to the Daily Yonder piece on rural venture capital, because it connects directly.
This one landed hard for me. The statistic. Rural businesses receive less than 1% of venture capital, despite representing 12% of U.S. firms. Less than 1%.
And the funding concentration number is staggering too. 5 major metro areas account for the overwhelming majority of VC investment. So it's not even spread across urban America. It's hyper-concentrated.
But here's the piece that the article highlights that I think deserves more airtime. Rural founders innovate at equal rates to urban peers when you control for size and sector. It's not a talent gap. It's not an ideas gap. It's an institutional support gap.
Which is exactly what the Absorptive Capacity paper and the Regional Innovation Systems paper are pointing at. The infrastructure for converting innovative ideas into funded, scaled ventures just isn't present in most rural places.
The article describes an organization called Ascend Rural, which is proposing place-based investment models. What do we know about that approach?
The summary we have is fairly high level. It describes a place-based model as distinct from sector-based or founder-quality-based investment logic. The idea being that you design investment infrastructure around the specific context of a rural place rather than trying to replicate urban VC norms in a rural setting.
Which makes sense. A rural founder in the agricultural technology space has completely different capital needs, growth trajectories, and exit options than a tech founder in San Francisco. The VC template doesn't fit.
And the institutional support piece, mentorship, networks, access to expertise, that's also geographically concentrated. A rural founder can't walk into a coffee shop and run into 3 potential advisors who've built and sold startups before. That density of informal knowledge transfer just isn't there.
Which brings us back to absorptive capacity. The rural innovator may have the idea and the drive, but the organizational infrastructure for connecting with knowledge networks, for understanding, assimilating, and applying what's out there, that's what's thin.
And the trust dimension too. If rural founders have had bad experiences with outside capital, with extractive investment that took value out of the community rather than building it, then that first component, the willingness to engage with new external knowledge, is already compromised.
Let's move on to the Nigeria electrification story, because that's a significant development.
It really is. Nigeria's Rural Electrification Agency has announced major progress on expanding electricity access. The headline numbers 1,350 mini-grids being deployed through a $750 million renewable energy project targeting 17.5 million people, and over 900 of those mini-grids are already rolling out.
That's an enormous infrastructure push. Mini-grids specifically. Why that approach rather than grid extension?
In dispersed rural populations, extending the main grid is often economically prohibitive. The cost per connection rises dramatically as you get further from existing infrastructure. Mini-grids, small, localized renewable energy systems, often solar plus storage, can serve a village or a cluster of households without requiring hundreds of kilometers of transmission line.
And the renewable angle is significant too. These aren't diesel mini-grids, which have their own cost and supply chain vulnerabilities. Solar-based mini-grids, once installed, have much lower ongoing operational costs.
The story doesn't give us a lot of detail on the technology mix, but the mention of a renewable energy project strongly implies solar-dominant systems, which, in Nigeria's climate, and given the dramatic drop in solar panel costs, makes a lot of economic sense.
What I'm watching for with a rollout of this scale is the operations and maintenance question. 900 mini-grids across rural Nigeria. Who services those systems? Who trains local technicians? That's where a lot of rural electrification projects have stumbled historically.
That's a real concern. The diffusion of technology literature, and we can nod back to the fintech paper here, consistently shows that adoption without accompanying human capacity for maintenance and troubleshooting leads to system failure over time. The technology arrives, the local knowledge to sustain it doesn't.
So even infrastructure is an absorptive capacity problem.
At a fundamental level, yes. Okay, let's also get to the rural AI workforce story from India, because I think it's one of the most genuinely surprising items in the library this week.
The headline: an estimated 200,000 workers in rural Indian villages and small towns are now labeling data for artificial intelligence systems. And a significant portion of them are women from tribal and conservative communities who are combining farming with night shifts doing this work.
The economics reported are around $275 per month, which, in a rural Indian context, is a meaningful supplemental income, potentially transformative for some households.
And the work itself: data annotation, data labeling. It's not glamorous, but it's essential. Every AI system that can recognize a face or understand a sentence was trained on data that a human being labeled. This is skilled, detail-oriented work.
What's striking to me from a rural innovation standpoint is the pathway. This isn't rural worker learns to code and moves to the city. This is rural worker acquires a new digital skill and continues to live in the village, contributing to the local economy and their household. That's a different kind of rural technology story.
It's also a story about what digital infrastructure enables. You can't do night shift data annotation without reliable internet access and a device. So where this is happening, there's been prior investment in connectivity.
Which makes it a conditional success story. The preconditions matter enormously. The 200,000 workers doing this job represent the rural Indian communities that got the connectivity. The question of how many rural workers could do this if connectivity were more widespread is unanswerable from this article. But it's the important question.
There's also a precarity dimension that I don't think we should skip past. Data annotation is a relatively low barrier entry point into the digital economy, but it's also highly automatable. Some of the AI systems being trained on this labeled data will eventually be capable of labeling data themselves.
That's the displacement risk, and it's real. The question is whether the skills and the confidence and the connectivity infrastructure built through data annotation become a springboard to higher complexity digital work, or whether it's a temporary ladder that gets kicked away.
Which is a version of the same question facing a lot of rural development pathways. Is this an on-ramp or a dead end?
And the absorptive capacity framework is relevant again here. If those workers and their communities develop the broader organizational structures, the learning networks, the training pathways, the trust with knowledge partners, to climb the value chain, it becomes an on-ramp. If the engagement stays transactional, it's a dead end.
Let's move to the organizations and events segment. The World Bank's Philippines Agricultural Initiative is a major one.
This is a significant program, $1 billion approved for the Philippines Sustainable Agricultural Transformation Project, targeting 5 million farmers. The program modernizes rice farming through climate-smart practices, promotes crop diversification, and introduces digital voucher systems for farm inputs.
Let's unpack the digital voucher system, because that's the piece that connects most directly to the fintech conversation we had in segment 1.
The idea is that instead of distributing physical subsidized inputs, seeds, fertilizer, through a centralized supply chain that's prone to leakage and corruption, you give farmers a digital voucher that they can redeem at participating suppliers. It puts more purchasing choice in the farmer's hands and creates a traceable record of how support dollars flow.
That's a meaningful design shift. It also requires the farmer to have access to a digital interface, a phone, some form of connectivity, to use the voucher. So again, connectivity is the precondition.
And the Philippines has significant rural-urban digital divides. The question of whether the voucher system will work equitably across the 5 million target farmers, whether it reaches the most remote and least connected, that's what I'd be watching closely in the rollout.
The climate smart practices piece. What does that look like in a Philippine rice context?
The summary doesn't give us a lot of detail, but in Southeast Asian rice agriculture generally, climate-smart approaches include things like alternate wetting and drying irrigation, which significantly reduces water use and methane emissions, and the introduction of flood-tolerant and drought-tolerant rice varieties. Both reduce input costs and improve resilience to weather variability.
And the crop diversification component, moving rice farmers toward other crops, that's a bigger economic transformation than any single technology adoption. Rice monoculture has been a food security anchor in the Philippines for generations. Asking farmers to diversify involves cultural and economic risk that goes beyond agronomy.
The trust infrastructure for that transition needs to be substantial, which once again brings us back to trust as a precondition for knowledge transfer and behavior change. That keeps coming up this week.
It does. Okay, what else is in the organizations and events space this week?
The Ascend Rural mention from the Daily Yonder piece is worth flagging as an organization worth following. They're explicitly building place-based investment infrastructure for rural founders. Given the less than 1% VC statistic, anything that's trying to build alternative capital pathways for rural entrepreneurs is worth monitoring.
And for listeners in rural innovation policy or practice, whether you're a regional economic development officer or a rural entrepreneur yourself, the JRC report on urban rural innovation metrics is worth downloading in full. The methodology section in particular. Because if you're trying to make the case for your region's innovation capacity to a government funder, having a rigorous measurement framework to point to changes the conversation.
That's a good practical flag. The measurement question, how do we demonstrate rural innovation capacity to funders and policymakers who default to urban proxies? That's one of the most consistently important operational challenges in this field.
All right, let's get into closing thoughts because I think there's a thread running through everything this week that's worth naming explicitly.
I was hoping you'd say that because I've been noticing it too. What's your read on it?
The thread is preconditions. Almost every item this week, whether it's fintech adoption in GCC banks, data annotation in Indian villages, mini-grid deployment in Nigeria, or digital vouchers for Filipino farmers, comes back to the same underlying question. What has to be in place before the innovation can actually work?
And the preconditions keep resolving into a short list. Connectivity, trust, learning structures, and some form of institutional support. Not necessarily government, but organizational infrastructure of some kind.
What strikes me about that list is that it's not a list of things you acquire once and then have. It's a list of things that require ongoing maintenance and investment. Trust erodes. Learning structures atrophy when key people leave. Connectivity needs to be maintained and upgraded.
Which is why the Regional Innovation Systems Framework is so useful. Cook's argument that you need interactive learning, not just co-located actors, captures this. The flows have to be active. A university that's physically present in a rural region, but not actually exchanging knowledge with local firms isn't part of a regional innovation system. It's just a building.
I think about this in terms of what I'd call innovation readiness at the community level. And I'd argue that rural communities are often further along on some dimensions of readiness than they get credit for, but lagging seriously on others.
What dimensions do you think rural communities tend to be strong on?
Social trust. Dense, high-trust social networks are actually more common in smaller communities than in cities. The problem is that those networks are local. They don't easily extend to the external knowledge networks that bring in new ideas and capital. It's bonding capital without bridging capital, in Putnam's terms.
That's a good framing. Robert Putnam's distinction between bonding social capital, strong ties within a group, and bridging social capital, connections across groups and to external resources, maps directly onto what you're describing.
And what the absorptive capacity paper is really describing, in organizational terms, is the building of bridging capacity, the ability to reach out to external knowledge, pull it in, process it, and apply it. That's the bridging function.
Where I'd push back slightly is on the framing of rural communities as simply lacking bridging capital. Some of the rural regions that show up in the JRC data as innovation leaders have been building those external connections deliberately, through public research facilities, through diaspora networks, through specific industry linkages.
No, that's fair. It's not structural. It's not inherent to being rural. It's a choice and an investment. The communities that have made that investment, that have built the bridges, show up differently in the data.
And I think that's what makes the JRC finding both hopeful and demanding. Hopeful because 20% of rural European regions are actually performing well. Demanding because it implies that the question is no longer, can rural regions innovate? It's, what are the specific investments required for a given rural region to build the conditions for innovation?
Which is a much harder and more specific question. And it's one that has to be answered differently for every region. The path for a rural Saskatchewan agricultural community is completely different from the path for a small coastal fishing town in Norway, even if the underlying framework is the same.
The Nigeria electrification story gets at this too. in a way that I find genuinely moving, actually. 17.5 million people getting electricity access through mini-grids. That's not incremental. That's a transformation in what kinds of economic activity are possible in those communities. Data annotation at night becomes possible. Cold storage for food becomes possible. Small manufacturing becomes possible.
Electricity as a precondition, which it is. It's easy to talk about digital innovation in context where electricity is assumed. In large parts of rural sub-Saharan Africa, it's not. And the mini-grid approach is genuinely clever because it doesn't require solving the full grid extension problem to make progress.
It's modular, which is consistent with how a lot of rural innovation has to work. Not a single large-scale solution, but a series of modular, locally appropriate components that can be assembled differently in different contexts.
The FinTech Diffusion Index is modular that way. The digital voucher system in the Philippines is modular. Even the absorptive capacity framework is modular. You don't have to fix all three components simultaneously.
I think that might be the most practical takeaway from this week's library overall. If you're working in rural innovation, policy, practice, investment, research, the question to keep asking is, which precondition is the binding constraint right now, in this place, for this community? Not, how do we do everything at once, but what's the one thing, if we fixed it, that would unlock the rest?
And different places will answer that differently. For some, it's connectivity. For some, it's trust, which means it's a relationship building problem before it's a technology problem. For some, it's capital access, which is where Send Rural and the place-based investment movement come in.
And for some, it might be measurement, having the right metrics to demonstrate that innovation is happening so that the case can be made for the next round of investment, which brings us full circle to the JRC Granular Metrics Report.
It does all connect. That's why this is a weekly show.
That's the week. The full library, every article we discussed, and the newsletter that started this whole conversation are at ruralinnovations.org.
See you next Friday.